basically was wanted to cover just three general basic topics. I don't like to go into a whole lot of detail because Congress has enough trouble figuring out the IRS code. You know, we have even more. But I like to cover just three general areas that have kind of changed over the last couple of years and that might be of interest to you. I'm going to save the foreclosure issue for last because if I start with that, we may not get to the other two. The first one has to do with if you buy a home, a residence, and then a couple of years later you sell the residence, what's the tax implications about capital gains and losses? I mean, years ago it was not an issue because you'd buy a home for $250,000 and 3 or 4 years later it was worth $500,000 back in the good old days. And the rule used to be that as long as you replaced that home with another home of equal or greater value, for example, you bought a home for $250,000, a few years later you sold it for $500,000. If you turn around and bought another home for at least $500,000 or more, you wouldn't have to pay income tax on the gain on the sale of your residence. But you had to replace it with another home of equal or greater value. Well, a few years ago they did away with that rule. They said it's forcing people to buy, it's too complicated, we're going to make it a lot simpler. Here's the way it works. If we're going to let you exclude, if you're married, married filing joint return, $500,000 of gain you can exclude from your tax return. In other words, if you buy a home for $500,000 and you sell it for anything less than $1 million, your gain is $500,000 and you can exclude the entire amount. No tax due at all. If you sell it for anything more than that, you buy it for $500,000, you sell it for $1.2 million. Whether you replace the home or not, it doesn't matter. That excess over the $500,000, that extra $200,000 is taxable. Unfortunately, if you sell a home nowadays, if you sell a home for less than you paid for it, unfortunately the losses on sales of personal residence are not deductible. Is it fair? No, it's not really fair, but the IRS isn't about fair. They're more about economic trends and what's going on in the economy, and that's really how they make the laws. That's one of the reasons they made this a law a year or two ago that Desiree had mentioned about this exclusion for debt relief, which I'll get into in a minute. But so they changed the law. They said, okay, you're exempt for $500,000. If you're single or married separate, it's $250,000. You can exempt that from any capital gain. Now, there's only a slight variation to that. The rule is it has to be your primary residence. Those same rules do not apply for second residence, whether they're income property, whether they're rental property, different rules. This is only primary residence. They let you exclude a certain amount of gain. It used to also be that if you decided for a time period when you own that home, let's say you rented it out for a period of time. You rented it out, you moved, you came back, you lived in it again. The old rule was as long as you lived in that home for any 2 of the 5 prior years before you sold it, you qualify for that exclusion I mentioned, $500,000 if you're married. That was the rule for quite a while. So people, what would they do? Maybe they'd move out of the house, they'd rent it for a while, but as long as they could prove that for 2 years of the previous 5 they lived in it, they got the full exclusion. Well, the IRS kind of caught hold of that. They saw there was a little loophole there. They're trying to raise revenues. They changed the rules now. So now it's not enough that you live in the house for only 2 of the 5 years. If you live in it for 2 of the 5 years, i.e. 40%, right? 2 of the 5, 40%, you're only going to be allowed to take 40% of that exclusion. So now they make you calculate based on the number of days of those 5 years that you live in it, that's what you're allowed on the exclusion. So in this example, let's say you live in it 2 out of the 5 years, the normal exclusion would be $500,000 if there's that much of a gain. Now it's only 40% of that, which is what, 200,000? So now the exclusion is 200,000 and you'd have to pay capital gains on the additional 300. So now they make you allocate and do a calculation based on how many days you lived there and how many days you didn't. It was a rental. So those rules have changed a little.